Today on The Truth of It, we talk domestic violence and the tragic murder of Hannah Baxter. We talk parents' rights and the threats to those rights. We talk Kathy Clubb and her pro-life appeal to the High Court of Australia, the tragic case in the US of 2,411 dead babies found in an abortionist's home, and finally, ANZ's new campaign on #LoveSpeech. Well, first up today, I want to talk about a very difficult subject, but it's the subject that's on all of our minds. It's on all of our minds because of the dreadful events that occurred in Brisbane with the domestic violence murder of Hannah Baxter, 31 years old, and her 3 children by their father and husband, Rowan Baxter. This is the case out of Brisbane for those who haven't caught up with the details. It's just dreadful. There was a history of domestic violence in the family. There was a domestic violence order against Rowan Baxter, and he'd breached that order. He was due to appear in court in March as a result of that. And there were family who were helping Hannah get away from him and so on and so on. And look, what we know is that somehow he intercepted his wife's vehicle as she was taking the children to school about a block from where she was living. He got fuel on the car or in the car or on the children and her. It's not entirely clear how it all worked out, but he set them on fire. He then tried to stop bystanders from helping as they burned. He then stabbed himself in the chest, killed himself on the scene. The 3 children died at the scene. Hannah was alive. She got out of the car, but with burns to 97% of her body. She passed away later that evening. Absolutely horrifying story that stopped the nation. Now, there has been some comments, or there was some immediate comment, and I want to make clear that I don't support this and I want nothing to do with this. There was some immediate comment about, well, we don't know the whole story, don't judge. Now listen, I will judge this man as a murderer because that's simply a statement of absolute truth, which is completely obvious. And there is nothing in the world which could ever justify murder, especially the premeditated murder, in the maximally devastating, painful and violent way of one's own wife and one's own children. There is not anything in the world that would mitigate responsibility for that in terms of any kind of injustice someone may perceive themselves to have suffered. And there's no evidence at all that that is what happened to this guy or anything like that happened. So I'm not even claiming that that's even in the picture. But for those who said those things, I just think it's crazy. This is one of those stories that just, it lingers with you. It's so gross. It is so extreme. There's a lot of bad news around us all day, every day, and a lot of these things just bounce off. This is not one of those ones that bounced off. This sticks in your mind. It's stuck in my head and bothered me for a long time because it's so terrible. And there's something particularly terrible about a father and a husband. It's like the whole universe turns in on itself and goes backwards because he's meant to be protecting and helping and looking after his family and his wife. And what's he doing is violating his duties as a husband, a father, and just as a man by doing this. And it is absolutely horrific. There is nothing which could ever take away that stigma and that reality and that truth that this man has committed the unthinkable. He's committed the unjustifiable. He's done something absolutely horrendous. So let's be very, very clear about that. And honestly, if that wasn't your reaction to this case, one of, just extreme pain and grief over this, then there's something wrong. There is something really wrong. There is no explaining it. It's dreadful. Now, what I want to address about this is not, the fact that a lot of people say, well, this is a gender thing. Look, the stats show that intimate partner violence and filicide, that is the murdering of children, isn't particularly gendered. It happens by men and women, although when men do the violence thing, it's far more serious, which does create, a more serious circumstance around male violence. There's no doubt about it. I'm not going to address that. I'm not really going to address the whole family court system. I'm not going to address many of those aspects that have come out of this. But one I do want to address is this. There's always somebody who brings up the whole Christian thing. There's always somebody who points the finger at Christianity, and whether it's because they think that, this is a patriarchal Judeo-Christian society and there's latent remnants of Christian thinking in society and therefore women cop it as a result, or men are violent as a result, or if it's just an overt and blatant criticism. And that's what I saw. This is incredible. Take this from The Independent. Somebody's actually written this. They've said, I forgot the name of the journalist, but it was published in The Independent. So why does the Liberal government do so little to reduce violence against women and and children. Part of the issue lies in Morrison's Pentecostal belief system. It preaches that women must submit to their husbands, be subordinate to them. And then it says this, which is absolute rubbish. Pentecostalism has many strains. In some, it's even acceptable to discipline an insubordinate wife with violence. Absolute rot. But anyway, Morrison's faith is one aspect of the reasoning behind the lack of support for domestic violence action. Now, that's just completely offensive to say that here's a Prime Minister who apparently is going to be less moved to do something about men burning their wives and children to death in cars because of his faith. A little bit of theology, it seems, is a very, very dangerous thing. And there's always someone like this who publishes the connection between apparently Christian and domestic violence, even though there's no study that supports this, even though there's no findings that support this. But I want to say this for those who are ignorant, or for those who may in fact be influenced by the things that are said in this vein. I want to answer the question, what does the Bible, what does Christianity actually say about how men should behave towards women? Because this is important. And in that vein, here's an intimidating but timely thought for men, especially if you're married or if you're in a relationship. And it's this: when you meet God, as you certainly will, and every Christian believes that absolutely, because it's true, we will meet God on a day as real as this one. But when we do, you as a man will be held accountable for the condition of the woman in your life in very important and key respects. That's extraordinary. When you meet God, the standard applied to you will be that standard which is given to men in Ephesians 5. And it's this: have you given yourself up for her? Is your love for her a sanctifying influence leading to her increased holiness? Is she free from blemishes inflicted by you, whether physically or spiritually? There is no higher standard in all of human existence than the standard given in Christianity for how men are to treat women in their lives. You know, I once met a guy, and we're all familiar with these stories. I met a guy who actually, he struck me as a dodgy character. I just got the wrong smell on him. And the wrong sense about him. And I was proven right with time. But unfortunately, I was quite young at the time, and I watched as this bloke, worked his way into a young woman's affections. And she was a very beautiful young woman, and she was somebody who, she was very innocent and all the rest of it, but he corrupted her, and he made her, just like he was, and took her down a slippery slope of all sorts of awful things. And then they got married, and he inflicted violence against her, both physical and psychological. And that's a tragedy that's continuing even now. And when we see that sort of thing, we're all, it's disgusting. It's something that it is purely satanic. But I raise that story because that is the hallmark of a bad man. That those he claims to love are worse off for it. And that is the standard that is set here in this part of the Bible, which I just quoted to you. By contrast, that the hallmark of a good man is that the people that encounter him, that he loves, that are a part of his life, are made better, are lifted higher, are greatly blessed, especially in that area of sanctification and holiness, made better and enriched in the most profound possible ways by his presence and by his actions. Such is his living for others. Such is his influence on others for good. And that's the standard. When you meet God, again, as you surely will, she is to be, I quote, in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish, Ephesians 5:27. And who has set that example from which we can draw? None other than Jesus Christ himself in his astonishing, selfless, sanctifying love for me and for you. It's his goal to present us to God in exactly that same way, sanctified, holy, etc. And he died for that. He gave himself up for that. Now, if that's the standard, if that's the kind of comparator that God asks of husbands to their wives, and this is the duty of husbands, and this is the apprenticeship into which boyfriends and fiancés have enrolled into, and in fact which men have enrolled into in general. If that's the standard, then it should cause you to gasp and to tremble, because men will be accountable to God in the final judgment for this very thing. Some are saying, that family violence is the product of male power, and that men need to be torn down and demasculinized in order to solve that problem. Power isn't the problem. Evil is the problem. Wickedness is the problem. It's the difference between a good man and a bad man in the way he behaves towards others, what he desires for others, and the way his presence enriches or drags others down. There's a difference between a good man and a bad man, not a powerful man and a subjugated man. That's not the difference. Now, we'll never be Jesus, of course, but with prayer and obedience, we can inch closer to this because this is our high calling. And one of the great tragedies in all of this debate is that, they don't think about character, that our badness, our goodness, our ability to be good and do good or whatever is based on our sex, male or female. It's not. Character is equally accessible to all. And yes, men are different and women are different. And yes, those differences are very innate and it's a part of how we live. But goodness, virtue, character, which is equally accessible to all regardless of gender or any other thing, is the most important thing. And the calling, the shape of that character, is given there in Ephesians 5. That is the calling upon a man's life. That is the calling and the image that Jesus Christ portrays. Next time someone tells you that this is all the Christian's fault, you might as well laugh or at least take great confidence that it is anything but true. This is a society that has broken apart the family, that has championed easy divorce, that's promoted individualism, empowerment and independence at the expense of loving others, that sexualised children as young as possible, which does turn young boys violent, which claims that women have no unique dignity that's to be honoured or upheld by society. They've done all these things. And when it all goes to custard and they see violence breaking out, they turn around and say, oh, it's the Christian's fault. No. I'm sorry. On this particular one, it's not on us. There is no standard higher in all the universe than the standard that Christ puts upon men in this world. Fortunately, he also gives us the power to be able to inch towards that standard and fulfill it. Otherwise, we'd be of all people most miserable. But there is no standard that's higher than that. So this one, it's not on us. It's on the world that has forgotten these great and priceless principles. All right, next up I'm going to talk about the issue of parents' rights and some of the threats to parents' rights. And if you're a parent or if you're considering becoming a parent, this is very important. I'm first going to tell you a little story, which is a current case here in Australia. It's the case of Byron and Kira Hordyke. They're a young Western Australian couple whose names I can mention here for the first time. They have two children, aged 6 and 2, and they moved in January 2017 to apply to a foster care agency to become providers of temporary respite care for children aged 0 to 5. With 45,800 children in out-of-home care in Australia, and the greatest need being in that 0 to 1 year old age bracket, and also for the fact that many of these children come from dangerous and difficult home situations. The requirement for carers like Byron and Kira with strong family homes and good community support is very, very great indeed. It's never been greater. And on all relevant competencies, Byron and Kira assessed very, very well. Very well. However, they're Christians, and they spoke quite openly with the foster agency about their faith. And over the course of those conversations, the agency decided to set them a worksheet on LGBT issues, which quizzed them substantially about their beliefs on these matters and required them to fill that questionnaire out on the subject. And the Hordykes, well, they said a few things. First, they made the point that they didn't think that this was going to be an issue, given that they wanted to provide out-of-home respite care for children in the 0 to 5 age bracket. So that's hardly going to be an LGBT concern there. However, in answering the questions, they declared that they wouldn't love a child any less because of an LGBT identity, that they would never require a child, let's say the child was with them for a long time, even though they weren't applying for that, they would never require a child to leave or do anything like that because of their LGBT identity. But they considered that the long-term placement of an LGBT identifying child, as if, again, would it happen? Don't know, but it might not be a good fit. Now, bear in mind that the fostering system does that. It finds good fits for certain children and it matches up the family. So this is not unusual in any way, shape or form. But because the Hordykes made it clear that they believe that homosexual conduct and so on is sinful in accordance with the Christian beliefs of nearly every Christian, they nonetheless failed the criteria of being able to create a safe home environment for foster children on account of their religious views. That's very serious. The Hordykes have taken legal action against that agency, but the agency applied to have the case thrown out on the grounds that it was baseless. But the State Administrative Tribunal found in favour of the Hordykes, deciding that the case was not baseless, but that it should continue to court. Now that's a good outcome. That's a small win early on in the process. This case is going to go to court, and this case matters. And it matters for a couple of reasons. It matters firstly because Christians have historically carried a great deal of the charity around such things as foster care. This case would mean that Christians are effectively unsuitable candidates to continue to do that into the future. It would set that kind of precedent. But also, it would set the precedent that says that basic Christian beliefs make a home unsafe for children. And there's very little difference in my mind between saying that someone's home is unsafe for foster children and saying someone's home is unsafe for children, full stop, their own children, for example. And you say, oh, well, that would never happen. And I say, well, actually, this is kind of the tip of the iceberg in terms of worrying movements in the world of policy and law, which are closing in slowly on parents' rights, particularly the rights of Christians with traditional Christian beliefs. This is a key reason, for example, why we oppose so-called conversion therapy legislation, LGBT conversion therapy. It's currently being considered by state governments right around the country. And the problem, firstly, is that conversion therapy is not our word. It's not a religious word, it's not a Christian word, and so it's very hard for us to know exactly what's being spoken of when that word is used. And it turns out it's not just anything that's coercive or abusive or in any way, outrageous like that, which of course everyone is completely against. But in fact, it could include anything that would carry the suggestion that a person's gender identity or sexual orientation is anything other than a one-way street, that someone can go from straight to gay, or they can go from cisgendered to transgender. If you suggest that they can come back the other way, or that maybe moving in that direction might not be right for them, then that could be considered conversion therapy. It could include prayer, Bible reading, responsible medical care. You think of a psychologist seeing a child who reports gender dysphoria, but the psychologist knows there's something else going on. For example, they might be suffering some kind of mania or depression. There might be underlying issues to solve before you put the scalpel in the child's hand. Or it could include preaching. It could include counselling. Preaching, for example, anything from the Bible, which says, you know what, acting on these desires is not what you should do as a Christian. Conversion therapy, that's what they would say. But importantly, it could include also parenting. And I say that because I've read a number of the policy documents, and one of the worst that I've seen is the Australian Labor Party's national platform from 2 years ago, which was subtly modified after an ACO campaign exposed what was written there in that platform. And their policy statement literally said that claims that a person's sexual orientation or gender identity can change, that is to say, could change from being transgendered or homosexual to something else. And by the way, it's not just Christians that think that. I mean, the LGBTQ community, queer questioning, believes the same thing, that there's a fluidity about these things. But nonetheless, if anyone claims that from a Christian point of view, then that should not be permitted, said the Labor policy. And importantly, if that happens in the family home, the policy literally said that the parents should become domestic and psychological abusers of their children, or should be deemed as such. That's extremely serious. And these sorts of policies, with wide-reaching effects, with ill-defined senses of what might amount to conversion therapy, but including definitely some of the things that I've mentioned at least, these kinds of things are being proposed with zero evidence that any children are being harmed in family homes on this basis, and actually no evidence that coercive or harmful or otherwise abusive practices are taking place in Australia today. Zero. None. The worst anyone could point to is voluntary counselling or requests for prayer and things like that if somebody asks for it. Or indeed a preacher in the pulpit, maybe reading 1 Corinthians 6 or something like that. That's the worst they can point to. Or a parent, indeed, who says, do you know what, we don't want Johnny to be Sally just yet. We would rather take this journey with him and see if he grows out of this. And in 70 to 80% of cases, children do. That's the true nature of conversion therapy. It goes to the heart of the family and seeks to break it apart from within. That is why cases like the Hordykes case are so important, because there's another front on which parents' rights are being undermined. This is a new frontier. It's something I raise for your information. But see, just as we've had a small win in relation to the Hordyke case, where the court will hear that case and says there's a basis for that case to proceed, so there's been a small win in relation to conversion therapy. In Queensland, the government had drafted some legislation which was to go through, but of course there's been a parliamentary committee into the legislation up there conducting an inquiry, and 1,100 ACL supporters wrote into that committee and raised your concerns. Your concerns were mentioned in the committee's final report, along with some very high-profile concerns from the AMA in Queensland, who were concerned about the ability to provide medical care under this legal framework, but also from the Queensland Law Society, who raised concerns about enforceability of these laws. And as a result, that parliamentary committee which conducted the inquiry has recommended that that bill at least be significantly changed. And that is a significant step of progress. And so what we need to do as people who care for the integrity of Christian families and understand something, which you know, I'm so grateful that I grew up in a Christian family, greatest blessing of my life. And I'm sure there's teeming thousands of Australians who believe exactly the same thing, to preserve that environment without the long arm of the government getting involved. It's so important that we respond to these calls to action and support the good work that is taking place to protect our parents, protect our children, and protect the integrity of families in Australia. Next up, I want to turn to the pro-life case of Kathy Clubb, and this refers to the February 19th decision of the Supreme Court of Victoria relating to Kathleen Clubb, mother of 13, who has unfortunately become a criminal with no further opportunity for appeal on account of her pro-life advocacy in the state of Victoria. Her crime, with which she was convicted, was communicating on the subject of abortion in a way that can be seen or heard within 150 metres of an abortion clinic. And the conviction was upheld, even though the police couldn't prove the content of the communication, that it actually was about abortion. The court decided that you could infer that it was probably about abortion, and that was sufficient to have her convicted and to have that conviction upheld. And it's the sad conclusion to a story which began, a few years ago, with a group of pro-lifers who care about women. They call themselves the Helpers, or as Kathy has said in a video we did with her, she said she's an apostle of God's mercy, someone who brings acts of mercy towards women in need. And through making simple offers of help to women who are approaching abortion clinics in Melbourne over some years, Kathy and her friends, the other helpers, saw literally hundreds of babies born alive who would otherwise be dead today. And I have, in fact, read letters from these women. I've seen photographs of their children. It is truly moving. The offers of help that were made to them were in the face of often dark and difficult circumstances. Some were all alone without any support. Some were trapped in domestic violence situations. Some financially destitute. Didn't matter. The helpers were there to help. And they rolled up their sleeves and did exactly that. But after some years of successful advocacy and doing remarkable work, the kind of Christian charity that just blows your mind. And you're so glad that there's people like this out there. But Fiona Patten doesn't feel that way. She was then leader of the Sex Party in the Victorian Upper House. She remains there, but as part of the Reason Party. And she introduced legislation which made their work, the helpers' work, a crime. And she knew what she was doing. There's a lot of excuses at the time. Women are being harassed, obstructed, all this kind of thing. None of that was happening. That was a great cover story to get this legislation through in the full knowledge that the only people going to be significantly impacted would be the helpers and people like them. And when the legislation passed, Kathy's simple act of attempting to pass a piece of paper to a woman who was approaching the East Melbourne fertility clinic was enough to have her arrested by several police officers. She was charged with a crime, the crime of communicating on the subject of abortion. She was convicted of that crime in the Melbourne Magistrates Court. That was appealed to the High Court of Australia. It's a long journey, but on the 10th of April 2019, so last year, the High Court decision came down, and they said this law under which Kathy was convicted of a criminal offence is valid. It will remain on the statute books in Victoria. It will remain on the statute books in other states that have since adopted it, like Tasmania, like Queensland, like South Australia, which is a proposal down there at the moment that may be coming on. These laws are now valid. But they didn't convict her of a criminal offence. They said, look, the law is valid, but whether she's actually done something wrong is going to be in the hands of the Supreme Court of Victoria. The Supreme Court of Victoria has made its decision. She is a criminal, as of the 19th of February 2020, and that fact will have implications throughout her life. You know, this case makes me think every time of an image of the High Court. And I remember the day of the case well, and there were barristers everywhere because every Attorney General in the country had sent legal representation to this case. States, territories, and the Commonwealth Attorney General. Why? Each one of them had come to oppose Cathy, to support the law of the state of Victoria, which had convicted Cathy of a criminal offence for doing this good deed, and to see her then therefore go down as a criminal. And I remember thinking, this is one of the most powerful examples I have seen in the modern age of that scripture in Isaiah chapter 5 verse 20, which says, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness." And I know there's a lot of legal complexity around this, but boil it down to just exactly what's going on here. And exactly what's going on here is that there is a woman who is being punished as a wrongdoer by the long arm of the state when she has done nothing but good, when she has shown nothing but charity, when she has been nothing but merciful, when her and her friends have helped women in difficulty for so long. And it reminds me, you know, of just how important public policy is and just how we can't afford to ignore public policy as Christian people, as churches and so on. Because when extending the gospel or extending the love of Christ or when spreading the truth of God becomes illegal, then we cannot do that thing which is most important for which we are called, which is to declare and speak and act all of those things in public and in our communities. That is why when the Apostle Paul talks about the governing authorities, he says, look, pray for them, because God's desire is that all people everywhere would come to a knowledge of the truth. That's God's wish. And these sorts of things, these public policies, these pieces of legislation, these court decisions, what do? They're set up in opposition to the knowledge of the truth. They stop the truth from being heard. They stop acts of mercy from being done. They stop the love of Christ from being spread. They stop these things. This is why Paul effectively prayed a religious freedom or a free speech prayer and said, pray for heaven's sake, and literally for heaven's sake, that the truth would be known and that the governing authorities would not step in the way. That's something worth praying about, said the Apostle Paul. He considered that crucial to his primary work as a Christian. And you know, the same problem is being seen on many angles today. We must stand against it, or the light of that truth will go out. And when that light goes out, it has severe implications right across the community. One of which is, in this case, lives could actually be lost. Because women who might have received help in their darkest hour, lives that might have been saved when they could otherwise have been killed, no longer will receive that voice, will no longer receive the mercy of Christ, as Cathy put it. Now, ACL invested quite a lot of money into this matter, as did others, including the helpers themselves. Everyone dug deep. The solicitors and barristers involved also did so sacrificially. But this time, we didn't succeed. I mentioned some wins in the last segment. Now I mention a loss. Or was it a loss? Yes and no, I think. I quite like what Cathy said at the close of this the other day. She said all those prayers, and there were a lot, went somewhere, but we just don't know where yet. So we look forward to seeing what's next in the area of pro-life advocacy. Perhaps this is the beginning of a bigger project. And indeed, ACL has a day of action in just a few weeks, which is all based around pro-life messaging in communities around Australia, because on this issue, we must finally push back. Sorry. It's coming true. I am hitting the cameraman. Next, I want to talk about something that's a little bit dark. It concerns a case of, and I kid you not, 2,411 dead babies. On the 3rd of September 2019, a prolific American abortionist called Dr. Ulrich Klopfer died. He was 79 at the time. He actually had begun practicing way back in 1973, which was a few months after the Roe versus Wade court decision in the US, which effectively legalised abortion right across the country. And by 1993, he was performing 3,500 abortions every year. And over the span of his 40-year career, he's believed to have performed about 50,000 abortions. And he gained the attention of pro-life advocates some time ago when an article was actually published in the Chicago Sun-Times detailing how that he and another abortionist in the clinics that he was working in would race each other to see who could perform the most abortions in a single day. And one of the doctors actually kept a tally and permanent marker on his leg in order to keep up with each other, which Anyway, you can imagine why he achieved the notoriety that he did during his life and why pro-life demonstrators continue to demonstrate outside his clinics and do other things like that. And in 2010, it came to light that he performed an abortion on a 10-year-old girl who'd been abused by her uncle, and he didn't report it. In 2013, he faced criminal charges for failing to report the statutory rape of a 13-year-old under similar circumstances. But these were the tip of the iceberg. He faced malpractice charges due to a patient requiring emergency treatments for incomplete, or many patients requiring emergency treatments for incomplete abortions, thousands of consumer complaints against his practice, dozens of serious violations in his clinics, and ultimately his medical license was suspended in 2016. And now these are all the things that were just known about. You can be reasonably sure that when there's lots of this coming to the surface and being seen, there's more under the surface. But the worst was yet to come. I mentioned that number 2,411. That is the number of dead babies that were found in his home after he died. His family discovered that he had hoarded 2,411 fetuses in sealed plastic bags stacked in boxes in his garage. Now, on the 13th of February, a funeral service, which was attended by 200 people, was held at the South Lawn Cemetery in South Bend, Indiana, for those children. They were all given names by pro-life advocates, and they were given a dignified burial. And there were some really nice speeches. If you want to see that funeral service, you can look it up. I think the Susan B. Anthony List Facebook page will have it on there. It's a bit unusual, but that's the group. And there is a live stream of that, which is still available, or it was live at the time. Why do I tell you this dreadful story? I mean, it's great what the pro-life advocates did, but to see this sort of thing is just, ugh. It's gross. It's awful. I tell this story because it hasn't been reported in many places. It hasn't been reported in many places because it's too confronting. It hurts the abortion narrative. It's the latest in a series of cases which demonstrate that something is attracting wicked and demented individuals to be abortionists and into the abortion industry. And that's true. I mean, the worst such case was that of Dr. Kermit Gosnell, who was found guilty of 237 crimes in May 2013, and he received 3 life sentences. And here's a guy, Gosnell, who regularly delivered live babies and murdered them by sticking scissors into their necks. Stories of babies who are alive outside the womb for up to 20 minutes before being murdered, a baby born in a toilet before being grabbed and killed with scissors. 4 of his former employees, not just him, but 4 of his former employees also pleaded guilty to murder in the course of those trials. His story is an abominable one, and of course they found all sorts of preserved fetuses in jars and all this kind of stuff in relation to his practice. But also there's the recent story of the undercover investigation by a guy called David Daleiden for the Centre for Medical Progress. And if you want to find more out about that, I've covered that case twice in the past. So search David Daleiden in YouTube, in our YouTube channel, and you'll find that coverage. But long story short, David Daleiden, through some heroic undercover journalism work, exposed the widespread normalised trade in body parts of aborted babies. Hearts harvested while still beating and sold to biotech companies. Whole heads, whole bodies, specimens that can only be obtained through delivering live babies and then killing them. And all this going on in relation to America's largest and most prolific abortion company provider, Planned Parenthood. This is widespread. This is normal. There was a trial of David Daleiden, who, by the way, was taken to court by the California Attorney General, can you believe, and has actually been convicted of offences for doing this undercover journalism. Not the abortionists who are involved in all these atrocities, who are trading in actual human organs, live, beating hearts and baby body parts and fetuses. Not them. No, the person who exposed it. This is mainstream over there. Now, there are people who say, well, it's the same here. Don't have evidence of that. But hey, this industry attracts this kind of stuff. What does it all mean? Do you know the abortion issue comes down to one question, and it comes down to one question only. Is abortion the taking of a life? Or is it quite meaningless? Is it just some kind of inconsequential medical procedure that's only reasonably invasive and not that important? Or is it actually the taking of a life? Because if it is the taking of a life, and remember a heart beats at 4 weeks, remember that unborn children respond to touch and to feeling and all the rest of it. Remember that there's all sorts of things going on here. It's separate DNA. It's got its own genetic blueprint. If it is taking of a life, then it is evil. If it is, then any excuse that someone might employ to justify an abortion becomes invalid, because the only proper answer is, when it's death, when it's killing, the only proper answer is there must be a better way. Surely there is a better way. If a child is going to be disabled, so do we kill disabled children? Surely there must be a better way. The mother might have been raped, so do we kill an innocent third party of a terrible crime? There must be a better way. There must be some other option. The family might be very poor. So now do we think that people who are poor are better off not existing, not living at all? Surely there must be a better way. See, this becomes the overarching thing. Is it the taking of a life? If it is, then there's a better solution. There has to be, because we don't kill people. That's a bit like the domestic violence instance I mentioned earlier. There is no excuse for killing. None. There is no mitigating circumstance. It is wrong. But of course we know that those reasons only account for a tiny minority of abortions. Mostly the reason is it would be inconvenient. And we know there is a better option. There is a better way. The whole moral reply to the question of abortion rests on that simple issue: is this a life? Once you answer that, every reason, every protest, every excuse under the sun is answered. But there's something else. If we know that this is a life, then we know that it's a terrible crime to take the life. And we know that the organised taking of such lives must be a very dark and evil thing. And that in the provision of mass abortions, there must be great wickedness. And here's the thing: evil is contagious. Evil does spread. Evil is malignant. It grows. It doesn't stay still. And it does corrupt more and more, and it has that capability. And evil attracts evil. Bad deeds attract bad people. Bad people attract other bad people who do more bad deeds. It has its own gravity. And if abortion is therefore evil, you can expect that it will also be a factory of evils. It will produce more. And guess what? As we have just seen, the evidence continues to mount up that is exactly what it is: a factory of further evil. Never doubt, if you do ever doubt, I should say, that evil is real, if you doubt that evil is a living personal force, it has power, that it does these things, that it does consume, it is malignant, it does have that energy, if you doubt, that Satan is real, look no further than a dark issue like abortion, and you see that is true. Very few things in our world manufacture as much darkness as this. Very few things in our world are responsible for so much pain, so much shame, so much regret, so much anguish as this. Very few things find their manifestation in people's darkest times like this does. It is a nest of wickedness. And I say this partly in the hope that if someone is about to go down this dark road, that you will be caused to stop and prevented from walking into the dark. Because what's the question? Is this taking a life? If the answer is yes, then there must be a better way. The answer to every circumstance comes out of that. And the better way is exactly what we said at the Walk for Life in Adelaide the other day. It is to love them both, mother and child. And there are so many people in Australia, in this community, in pregnancy support centres, in churches all over the place, who will provide all the help in the world to achieve that and to walk down that pathway of a better way. But why do I say this? Because we need to stop this great evil of abortion. We must do it. And we must do it in the pro-life generation, as we keep saying. Great progress in other countries. There's going to be progress here, and that's why ACL is running a day of action in the month of March, where in every single state and territory, people are going to have the opportunity to go out into their communities with the truth that abortion takes a human life, and they're going to put that in letterboxes in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of homes in one day. And if you're near one of those days of actions, you're going to get an email, and it's going to invite you to be a part of it. If you're not near one of them and you don't get an email, I ask you to pray for that day, but also understand that this movement is going to grow. And we are going to have an evergreen, continual grassroots activist movement which goes out into the community to shine light in dark places, to convince our neighbours and our communities and electorates around this country of the truth, and to change hearts and minds, and therefore to send an important policy message to Canberra and to change voters' intentions at elections and get movement on these dark issues of our day which look so hopeless. And even as I was doing this segment, I was sitting there thinking, this is heavy. We can make change. When people see this, people will respond. And so be ready for that day of action. Or if it doesn't come to a place near you this time, be ready for when it does, because it will. We're going to create the biggest grassroots activist movement this country's ever seen. And it's going to go on continually, not just during election cycles, because we're changing people's minds. All right, finally, we're going to deal with something called love speech, which is comes off of the back of ANZ, this ANZ Bank's new marketing campaign in light of the upcoming Mardi Gras in Sydney. They have launched a campaign saying we need more love speech with the hashtag love speech. It's a campaign that they say is to highlight the hurtful effects of negative language on the LGBT community and to promote love speech instead. It includes a browser extension that you can download, and it will scan the web pages that you're accessing, and it will change so-called hurtful words on web pages for fun-loving emojis. I quote, "There is also a downloadable guide to appropriate language to be used around the LGBT community, and there's a whole range of smartphone themes which take allegedly hurtful words, slogans like marriage is between a man and a woman, which is apparently hurtful, boys should never wear dresses, which is apparently hurtful and needs to be changed, and you don't look gay and things like this, and it does little edits with rainbows and different special effects to turn them into happy statements, and that's your smartphone theme to go as your wallpaper. And you know, as I sort of, it's supposed to turn hate speech to love speech, and as I thought about this, I felt unusually well qualified to talk about love speech. Because it turns out that Christians, indeed God himself, literally wrote the book on love speech. What do I mean? Well, take a listen to this. "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life." John chapter 3, verse 16. "Greater love has no one than this, than that someone lay down his life for his friends." John 15:13. "But God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." Romans chapter 5, verse 8. "And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength." Mark chapter 12, verse 30. Jesus answered him, "If anyone loves me," that is to love the Lord your God, "if anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him." John chapter 14, verse 23. "But whoever keeps God's word, in him truly the love of God is perfected." 1 John chapter 2, verse 5. "I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me." Galatians 2:20. "In this, the love of God was made manifest among us, that God sent his only Son into the world so that we might live through him." 1 John 4:9. "We love because he first loved us." 1 John 4:19. Like I said, literally wrote the book on love speech. And I just think, if hashtag love speech is the campaign, then we should be tweeting, we should be Facebooking, and we should be promoting the eternal and priceless love of God at every opportunity that we can, because that is true love like you'll never find in this world, but which comes from God himself. I'm Martyn Iles, and that was the truth of it. Hey guys, make sure you click like to like the video, or hit the subscribe button down here and click on the bell so you don't miss any notifications. And to watch more videos, just click here. Cheers. Go on, click one. You know you want to.